We're here to talk about an extremely important topic today, and that's communication. My name is John Krajicek. I'm an executive professor with the Mays Business School, Texas A&M University, where I teach MBAs, executives, other master's students such as masters in real estate. I teach business communication. I teach our students how to more effectively write in a business context as well as public speaking. But I take this charge of teaching business communication in a much broader way than just words on the page or giving speeches. I think communication is about so much more. Communication is about our presence, the way we carry ourselves, the way we interact with people. And so what I'm really doing with my students and my executives is I'm serving more, I think, a role of executive coach, helping them develop their presence and the way they interact with people. And as you'll see in a minute, I have a real passion for this topic, and I think it's just, we almost cannot overestimate the importance of it. So I want to start with a provocative image. It's something that you've seen before, and what I would like you to do when you see this image is I'd like you to find the arrow. So look for the arrow here. Do you see the arrow? If you didn't see it, I'm going to show it to you now. So there's the arrow. Now that you've seen it, you can't not see it, right? There it is. Now just file this away. I'm going to come back to this in a few minutes. I'd like to start with a quote today, and this is a quote from a television commercial by EDS, Electronic Data Systems. This commercial ran a few years ago. And if you can imagine the voiceover that I'm about to deliver to you, while this voiceover is going on, there's a lot of action happening. There's EMTs life-flighting people, there's construction workers in hard hats out on a construction site, there's things getting done. And while this action is happening, here's the voiceover. The voiceover says, the world wasn't built by people who sat around the table and talked. No, the world was built by action. Action isn't talking. Action is doing. Action is done with the race while talking still sits at the starting line tying its shoes. Action keeps the promises that talking can only make. Now, let's notice a few things about this extended quote here. Obviously, part of what's going on is EDS is trying to promote the fact that they're all about action. They get things done. And we can understand why a consulting company would want to send that message. The bad rap on consultants, after all, is that they come in, they talk a good game, they charge a lot of money, and they leave. Nothing gets done. And so part of what EDS is doing in this television commercial is they're managing that perception. They're managing that bad image, and they're saying we're different. We actually will get things done. So we notice from this quote, and we all know this is true, that often something can be talked to death. We know about paralysis by analysis. We know that action speaks louder than words. And we know that sometimes we can talk about something so much that we're just not getting anything done. But on the other hand, I think that in this quote, there's something that's coming out here, which is sort of a privileging of action over communication in a way that's a little bit extreme, a little bit unfair, and frankly, a little bit irresponsible. Because the fact is, even though the quote says the world wasn't built by people who sat around the table and talked, of course it was. The world was built by people who sat around the table and talked. The world was built by people who had plans, who had ideas and communicated those ideas effectively to others. The world wasn't built by people who just went out without a plan, without direction, without management, and started building things. And so I think that this quote here really shows something that I think is unfortunate, which is that a lot of people don't give communication its credit that it's due. Communication is just absolutely essential to everything we do. I guess if you take their quote literally, this would be work getting done, and this image would be no work getting done. And of course, when you look at it that way, it's sort of absurd, isn't it? Things would not get built without talking, without planning, without organizing, without communicating. This is how things get done, is communication, organizing, planning, managing people, etc. So if EDS, or your company for that matter, has a great idea, how do they, quote, get it done without selling the idea? Communication. Convincing the client? Communication. Negotiating prices, resolving disputes, managing employees, managing web presence, reporting to stakeholders, etc., etc., etc. In other words, without effective communication, nothing gets done. And of course, that's not quite right either, because the reality is, without effective communication, too often, the wrong thing gets done. And that's just bad business. It's inefficient. You have to do things over again. You have to apologize to clients. It damages your reputation, etc., etc. But as you all know, this is too often what happens. Too often the communication process doesn't work well, and nothing gets done, or the wrong thing gets done. And so again, I don't think we can overstate the importance of communication. The mantra for the classes that I teach at Mays is this: effective communication is essential to successful business. And of course, it's essential to a successful marriage as well. It's essential to being a successful parent. Communication is almost like the air we breathe, or the water we swim in. It's all around us. We're constantly communicating to everyone around us and receiving signals from everyone around us. And yet we don't think about it too often. We just kind of operate under the assumption that we're communicating with people and that it's working, but too often it's not. Here's a quote from a real estate executive, Ron Robertson, at Caldwell Companies. Ron says, "Clients place a high degree of trust in their real estate representative. So the ability to communicate effectively and gain trust is of the highest importance to the success of the realtor. The way you communicate is often your image. It's not only getting things done, it also says something about who you are. It's your presence, it's your identity. And so in many different venues, it's critical, but I think in the real estate industry, you can see how critical this is as you're dealing with clients, as you're in the business of selling. Perhaps you're speaking at a local Rotary group or a civic club. This is the image of your company, and the way you communicate is critical. So if it's that important, let's stop and ask ourselves, how does this process work? How do we communicate? How does it happen? If I get an idea in my head and I want to communicate it to you, how do I do it? Well, we're probably all familiar with the old model of communication, the two talking heads. We have a sender and we have a message and we have a receiver, right? And so this old simple model works this way. This guy gets an idea, and somehow through the wonders of the brain, this idea is translated into sounds. His vocal cords emit sounds out of his mouth, and the airwaves are disturbed. And it moves through the air between these two individuals and into the ear of his listener, and poof, the same idea pops up in his head. Well, I think you can see this is an absurd model. It's absurdly simplistic because so many things can get in the way here. It doesn't work quite this way. It's not just this simple, I have an idea, I encode it in a message, and you get it. And think about all the various things that can get in the way of this process. There can be cultural differences, for example. There can be just differences of definitions of terms. Perhaps my audience has a different orientation, a different kind of conception of what a particular word means. And so I'm miscommunicating without even realizing it. This is more often than not, I think, what happens. So let's look at some of the other ways this can happen. We have gender differences. We have Harry and Sally here. Harry's from Mars and Sally's from Venus. We have, in my world, the professor talking to the student. Well, that student may be nodding his head. We may think we're communicating, but the reality is the student doesn't get it. Often because we've used terminology that the student just doesn't get. This is why often an expert is the worst person to teach a beginner, because we don't know what that person knows and what that person doesn't know. And so we're throwing words at them that they may not quite get. Think about this if you're a parent. Often parents and their children do not communicate well. And it's because they have a different orientation. They bring different context to the situation. So here's a mother saying, "Where have you been? Your father and I have been worried sick about you." What does the daughter hear? "My parents just don't trust me." This is an entirely different message. Even though we have words that are not ambiguous, They're very clear words, but this is an entirely different message. This is too often how the communication process works. So you may be at a business meeting, you're conveying an idea, and sitting around the table are people nodding their heads. They even might reply to you in a way that tells you they're getting it. But because of age differences, cultural differences, who knows? Differences again in terms of definitions of particular words. The process is not working quite as seamlessly as you think that it is. So in other words, unfortunately, too often, I know that you believe you understand what you think I said, but I'm not sure you realize that what you heard is not what I meant. I submit to you that more often than not, this is what's really happening. One reason that the communication process doesn't work as smoothly as we often think it does is something that comes out of a book called Made to Stick. This is by Chip and Dan Heath, the Heath brothers. Subtitle of this book is Why Some Ideas Survive and Others Die. And what the Heath brothers do in this book, it's a brilliant book, is they catalog the many reasons why messages are not sticky, and they try to give us a better way to package our ideas in a way that our audience is really going to get. It's really going to stick with our audience. It's going to be more memorable. It's going to be more clear. And so it's a terrific book. But one moment in this book I want to tell you about is something called the Tappers and Listeners exercise. This came out of a particular PhD dissertation in which the woman doing this dissertation, part of her, at one moment in her dissertation, she had taken a group of people and broke them into two different camps. One she called tappers, and one camp she called listeners. And then she paired them up. She paired up a tapper with a listener. And the job of the tapper was pretty simple. They were given a list of 10 very popular songs such as Star Spangled Banner, Happy Birthday, etc. Their job was to merely tap that song out on the tabletop. The job of the listener was to guess the song. So they asked their tappers and listeners to predict the outcome. I don't know whether they somehow controlled the moment so that the tapper couldn't see the listener, but somehow the tapper was tapping without knowing if the listener was getting it or not. They asked the tappers to predict, do you think your listener is getting this song or not? The response, an unbelievable 50%. 50% of the tappers said, oh yeah, my listener's getting it. They're hearing this song. It's very clear. It's easy. What was the reality? The reality was 2.5%. 50% expectation, 2.5% result. And we all know why, if you really think about this. The reason why is because the person tapping could hear the song in their head. So as they were tapping, the song was playing in their head, so it seemed so obvious to them. But the listener didn't have that context. They don't share a brain with the tapper. And so to them it was sort of disconnected. They might have thought something sounded familiar, but they didn't have that song playing in their head, so they couldn't guess the song. This, unfortunately, is too often how the communication process works. And there's a name for this, and the Heath brothers call it the curse of knowledge. The curse of knowledge is this: we forget what it's like to not know what we know. We forget what it's like to not know what we know. Once you know something, it seems so clear to you that you have that built-in assumption, and it seems kind of ridiculous to have to explain it to someone else. I've actually seen my daughter learn something new, and in a matter of a week after that, say to one of her friends, you didn't know that? Everyone knows that. She'd already forgotten that she just learned it a week ago. This is often how we operate. Once we learn something, it seems incorporated into our brain in an obvious way. We assume our audience knows it too, but too often they don't. So there's an example of the curse of knowledge. If you didn't see the arrow the first time, you can't not see it now. And I suspect at least one of you in the near future will be driving down the road with a friend. You'll see a FedEx truck. You'll look up and you'll say, hey, have you ever noticed the arrow in the FedEx sign? And if your friend says no, you'll say, how could you miss it? It's obvious. You have the curse of knowledge. And this is one of the major culprits in effective communication. So let's review. So far, hopefully I've convinced you that number one, effective communication is absolutely essential. It's essential in your business life. It's essential in your personal life as well. Number two, unfortunately, all too frequently, the process just doesn't work, or at least it doesn't work as well as we assume that it does. And the reason why, number three, is because it really is a deceivingly complex process. It's not so simple. It's not that simple talking head model. There's so many things that can get in the way, and that often do. And usually that comes in the form of assumptions we're making about our audience. And so with all that said, how in the world do we do it? How do we communicate effectively? How do we make this happen despite these obstacles? Because we all know that we do. We know that the communication process does work, obviously. So I think the key word here, how do we make it work? We make it work with awareness. We've got to be aware and vigilant about a number of things. One, we should be aware of the pitfalls of communication. I mean, if you realize how difficult the process is and don't operate under that normal assumption that it's so simple, I think you will instantly become a better communicator. You'll just be a little more perceptive about the words you choose, about who your audience is, etc. Be aware of the curse of knowledge. Think about who your audience is. Who is this audience? What do they know and what don't they know? And even if they seem to be nodding their head, you can make sure. Now, of course, you have to be careful. You don't want to be condescending. You've got to somehow walk that line, that balance between being thorough and complete and making sure your audience is getting your message, and at the same time not being condescending. And that's something that everyone has to negotiate. It's not easy. Communication process is difficult, but that's your task, is to give that message in a clear, effective way, make sure you're getting through, and at the same time not be condescending. You just have to be aware of the audience and context. You've got to figure out, who is this I'm talking to? What do they need in this particular context? Too often people make the mistake of data dumping. They just throw everything at the audience, no matter who they are, what the context is, and they assume their audience will figure it out. We see this in email sometimes. You send a 3-page email when a one paragraph would do. Well, unfortunately, that critical message doesn't get through because the context called for something much more clean and concise. So you've just got to be vigilant. Remember, who is the audience, what is the context, and let that dictate your style of communication. You also must be aware of your body language. The communication process is about a lot more than just words. It's about the tone of voice, it's about your body language, because your body language is sending signals to your audience constantly. It's also about emotional and social intelligence. The communication process is not just about IQ. It's about self-management, self-awareness, awareness of others, management of others. In a separate talk, we'll get it deeper into emotional and social intelligence. And finally, it's about presence. How do you carry yourself? What kind of vibe do you have? What is your energy like? What do people see when they interact with you? What do they feel from you? How do you carry yourself? How do you move through the world? This is key to your communication process. I'm going to leave you with a quote now. This is Peter Drucker, management guru. And Drucker said, as soon as you move one step up from the bottom, your effectiveness depends on your ability to reach others through the written or spoken word. And you know this is true, especially those of you who are leading your organizations. You know that as important as IQ is, and it is important as word choice is, and it is important, it's the way you convey things, the way you present yourself that really matters. And so with that, I thank you. It's been a pleasure.